maple syrup. Hey, everybody.
Maple syrup.
Maple syrup.
That was a little like depressing for maple syrup. I
was going to say that got a little moody.
Yeah,
there,
sorry, that's a big mood.
But you can see what Sense feeling something today. You can see so.
Blue. I'm okay, actually. I'm okay because today we have one of the guests that we've been kind of chasing down for the last little while, in terms of people that we really want to talk to. And I think the audience will be really interested in hearing what she has to say. Welcome, Tanya Pobuda from Ryerson University. Tanya is a PhD candidate, and you just did your dissertation. How was that?
Yeah, I literally just finished writing it at the end of March, but I actually have a lot. I learned a lot over the last month or so, so I actually added a bunch this week. So,
oh wow,
yeah.
Just never stops.
Yeah, my advisor hasn't looked at my final chapter yet, so I keep sneaking things in. So that's what I'm doing.
That's fair, actually. Until someone looks, it's not actually like have to be finished, handed in. Yeah.
It's like Schrodinger's dissertation.
That's exactly.
It's finished as long as you don't look. It's fine.
That's right.
That's right. So for those of you in the audience who don't know who Tanya is the researcher behind the evidence that came out over the last couple of years in regards to the representation in terms of ethnicity, gender, culture, all that kind of stuff in the board gaming industry, specifically in the top realms of BGG-ness. And the research that she's been conducting since then, that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're super, super stoked to have you here, Tanya. As usual, anybody out in the audience, if you have questions for Tanya, please put them in the chat. We'll get them up on screen and we'll get you the answers that you want. So Tanya, tell us a little bit about your origin story. How did you get into gaming? What made you pick this as your research topic?
Research,
yeah. It's a really good question. So I actually went back to school. I had a career in mainly high-tech life sciences. I'm a certified project manager, and I worked in communications for years and years, and big multinationals. And I was a tech reporter before that, and I've had all the jobs everywhere. And I decided that I was going to go back and do my master's. And I focused in on serious games because I was very interested in serious gaming for training and learning, particularly in a corporate context. But then I really fell in love with academia. And I was actually going down a road, I was quite far down a road of looking at empathy, empathy machines and VR. And I actually did some really significant work on creating VR interventions for training and learning. I hooked them up to chatbots, and the chatbots would say mean things to you, and it was basically to give people a way to have difficult conversations in the workplace and cope with bullying and harassment behaviors.
That's super interesting.
Yeah. And so I was, I had gone down that road quite far. And then I started to realize that I got really pessimistic about, particularly VR as an intervention, as an empathy tool. And I board gamed my entire life. And my partner and I, in fact, I'm sure every friendly local game store in the city can attest to this. We were like Norm from Cheers. We were constantly spending all of our time in board game stores. And literally pre-pandemic, probably 4 times a week. And I started to think, there's a lot more in board games that can help with empathy. And I started to we were always very, very interested in watching like board game media. We were watching the Dice Tower and Board Game Geek and all of the various channels, Discriminating Gamer and all of these. This is what we don't have cable. So we just watch that all day, every day. Suzanne Sheldon and Mandy Hutchinson's podcast, we were listening to all of it. And I got really, really interested. And I went to my advisor, and I think I disappointed some people in abandoning my previous projects. I had gone quite far down a road and saying, there's something here. Like board games need this academic attention. They need the love. And I started to realize that there were some really sort of structural infrastructure, foundational issues in the board gaming sector that I thought I should look at first. So in 2018, I actually did a small-scale study with Analog Game Studies And that was that first study. It was a smaller one where I looked at who designs the top 200 Board Game Geek games, and then who makes what does the artwork look like in terms of representation.
Why are there more sheep than any other represented person?
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
That was actually the great Aaron Ryan study at Cardboard Republic. And I read that and I thought, this is so interesting. I wonder if it's changed. So I started to look at, representation, because again, I saw some sort of infrastructure issues in board gaming. And I thought, I'll start there. And I did that small scale study, and it really, really took off. There was so much interest in it. And it was actually because, initially I was trying to find an answer to a question, because I was interested in doing a little bit of publishing, but I was actually watching an exchange on Twitter, and I thought, well, I'll just Google it. I'll find out the answer, and realized I can't find the answer. And I thought, this is really strange. Like, the board game's such a big deal. Everybody I encounter, in post-secondary, random people I talk to are very, very interested in board gaming, but there's not that much scholarly attention being given.
Right.
Fortunately, I connected with Analog Game Studies, which is the journal that looks at these kinds of issues, and sort of pitched this idea of, I need to find the answer to this question, which is who designs these games, and what does the cover or representation look like? And that's how it got started. And then I thought, based on the feedback that I got from that initial study, I would really ramp up and move my dissertation topic to a much more expansive look at gender representation and racial representation in board gaming, and hear from the community about what they think about it. So kind of layering on my existing empirical research with community perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I also did a series of interviews. So I did an online survey and a series of interviews to kind of get a picture of, what does representation mean to the community that are really committed to board gaming.
It's really interesting, even just in what you're saying, today being, June 2nd, and yesterday being June 1st, and June being Pride Month. And yesterday, a lot of people were not necessarily talking about it, but today, specifically today, there's like 2 or 3 threads on 2 or 3 of the major board gaming forums on Facebook that are all about representation. And it is remarkably amazing, just how many people are upset about people talking about this. So you've definitely, I mean, it wasn't just you, but the topic ruffles a lot of feathers.
This was the fun. I think it was Nicole Hoy that put up the funny meme today. It's like,
oh yeah,
it's either you're basically you're either the old norm or you're political. Like, that's all that there's no difference. So if you don't match what the old standard is, you're automatically rocking the vote. There's almost no in between anymore.
Right. And that's a really dangerous thing to talk about. Dangerous in the way that, I mean, like, so I often talk about the IZE. For those of you who are American, Z is a Z. The IZE-ness of things. Like, so when I am politicized, Tanya and Erica are politicized for very different reasons, because, they are women, I'm, Asian. And so we have become politicized. That means that somebody else did it to us. That's what the IZE means.
We can't choose that.
We didn't choose it. I would rather not be part of the political discourse.
We push against, not enforce. Yes.
So it's just this really interesting thing when you read on the forums, people talking about great topics like, hey, what are some games that did a good job of representing this or that, or this culture, or this, subsection of humanity, really. And then people just getting in this big kerfuffle about whatever.
Don't bring politics to my board game table.
Yes, or I believe in representation, but as soon as board games start looking like it's pushing the reverse, then I'm out.
Yeah.
Well, see you
People
later.
are very, very uncomfortable change, and a lot of the change that's being asked for right now is automatically going to be sensitive in nature, because it's things they don't want to deal with in their own lives, let alone in their hobby space. We'll just put it that way. It's a discomfort for sure.
It's interesting. So Paul Saxberg says, trying to maintain bridges of communications to both sides risks being ostracized by both sides, it seems. And, I mean, Paul, you're right. There's sometimes when, community. When you, it's like there's this almost tacit belief system that some people have that if you're not with us, you're against us, right? And that's not necessarily true if you know the people, but it sometimes looks like that. And that's, I think, is where you're getting that pushback from the sides that they think, but I thought you were an
You
ally
don't
of
speak out
ours.
against this, you're automatically on the other side,
Yeah.
right? We're getting definitely into a bit too extremes at the moment, and we'll say COVID's not going to help, because putting behind a computer is
No.
just going to amp up all of that
Gives me more time
disconnectedness.
to
Going
do
back
this.
to your empathy, bringing it all the way back to empathy again. You cannot have empathy for people you do not see.
Yeah. So, I mean, really, Tanya, you're actually still studying empathy. So it's okay.
No, that's exactly it. I think it comes down to that. And you know, it's really interesting. I started my career in early tech in the early 90s. And one of the interesting things, and I talked about this in response to some questions online, because I did experience, just like I did with the first study in 2018, a really visceral reaction to the empirical audit that I did of representation around gender and race, specifically just around the count. And what it was really interesting to me, that visceral, angry reaction to the findings, which are just numbers, right?
Yes.
You're like, I didn't make these up. I just collected them.
No,
Yeah.
I sat there with a magnifying glass and a pen and just did this work. And what I think is really interesting, and there's a lot of parallel, I think, right now I'm noticing, to early personal computing. So in the 90s, early 90s. And one of the interesting things to me, and why it seems so, it's a cognitive dissonance that I can't quite figure out. There were two companies that I did work for. So I was a tech reporter, and then I made the pivot to work in a large multinational agency. I had two clients. And one of the clients, and I'm not going to say who they are, one of the clients really focused on expanding their market.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a recognition. It was a really interesting compensation model that they had for all of their executives and employees. They wanted to expand their base. And they focused on giving, workshops to kids and workshops to moms and workshops to grandparents. And they really wanted to expand their base. And they gave away stuff. They held literacy clinics. And they were comped not on their saturated market, which was, in this case, middle-class white males, because they were already using these tools. But they recognized, because this is how every business grows, that they couldn't keep selling to that saturated base,
Mm-hmm.
right? They had to radiate out from that beachhead, to use a military metaphor.
Mac
And
was really good for that for
client,
schools, right? I mean, think about the people that had their first computer access was a Mac. You're going to have that connection now to that product.
Totally right. And it was also like a very early recognition that you could get kids before the age of 11, you'll have them for a really long time. And so, there was
cigarettes did until they weren't allowed anymore. I hate to say it, they did. They actually advertised to children.
That's absolutely right. And there's a lot of really terrible marketing angles here. But in terms of market expansion, then I had another client who was really, really, they had a very elitist view that nobody really wanted a computer. They didn't see a market for it. They really focused in on mainly engineers, scientific and technical computing. That company no longer exists. So one of the things that I think is really, really interesting, and I see a lot of parallels, I've worked in white male-dominated spaces my entire career, that it's a really fascinating sort of ideological construct, that things of present and import and concern are those things which kind of serve that white male monoculture. And those are the mainstream primary concerns. And I've watched companies do this for now decades.
Mm-hmm.
And when they do this, when they focus in and there's almost a elitism, a snobbery, an unwillingness to kind of imagine a different audience for their stuff.
It's like not me kind of thing, right?
Yeah,
exactly. They don't survive. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that one of my motivations in doing this work is I've had to advise CEOs, I've had to advise funders, I've had to advise venture capitalists and angel investors about where the market is heading, where it's going, what the strategy should be. And I think in this effort, I'm really hoping to make those connections with people who are looking to expand this market. Because I think that the other thing, I can't convince, this is the other, Erica raises a really good point about empathy. I know after doing this work for years and years, I can't convince a certain audience to care about people. I can't do that. But I can speak to money. And I can speak the language of money, and I can tell businesses what direction they should go if they want to survive.
It's financially viable.
Yeah. And I mean, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, and we can look at the past and see what's happened and then make that projection. We've seen this in other industries and other markets of how things fail and how things thrive and what made something survive and what made this thing kind of die out. Ian O'Toole says, hi all, hi Tanya. Thanks for posting your research. It was super interesting to see some hard numbers. And Ian is one of the best illustrators in the business. And so it'd be lovely to have Ian's point of view at some point in terms of, how does illustration
requested or how much influence do they get, that kind of thing too. Yeah.
In fact, Ian, we don't have a guest for next week yet because we forgot to book one.
We have an idea, but we're having an issue getting the guests to talk about that topic. So,
but if Ian wants to come on next week, we would gladly have Ian on. Is what I'm saying.
You know what I just realized as a total aside, except for one.
Yeah.
Every single game I have has at least a woman or a minority of some kind on it.
That's great.
The only one that doesn't is Ghostbusters because they don't actually have any females in the cast. There's one female, like in pretty much the entire movie. But everything else, I was like, oh, there's we've got girls, and then we've got girls, and we've got Matthew, and then even on Bosk, there's 2 hikers, and one of them's female. So
it's getting there. So Tanya, tell me, why are you doing this work, and what's your philosophy behind how you teach and how you research?
Yeah. So, I think that the one thing that I really tried to do with this work is I really wanted to give a platform and a voice to the respondents that particularly filled out my survey, but also the people who conducted some qualitative interviews with me for the dissertation. And what I wanted to do was add a dimension. The previous study that I had done didn't talk about whether this was important to people. So, yes, there was a lack of representation in board game design, starkly so, that it was mainly a particular demography of designer, white males, that were doing the work of design. And, when you have numbers in the mid 90s, low 90s, percentage-wise, you can see that there's something happening with the labor practices of a particular sector. And in the presentation I gave for Bradley Tabletop, I kind of talk about the different sectors where this plays out. And there's some real issues in terms of money lost, right? And then when you look at the board game artwork that I analyzed, you can see that there's a real overrepresentation of white male identity on the box art. And the focus for me was really to take those numbers, and present them, just flatly present the numbers, and then ask the community. And in fact, the people who filled out my survey didn't have the benefit of seeing my analysis. They just were responding based on their own lived experience. How does this, play out in your game groups? How does it make you feel? And I was asking a lot of those kind of psychometric, Likert scale kind of questions, making assertions and asking for their feelings about whether they strongly agreed or strongly disagreed. And this particular research was really about, sitting with a lot of these stories. And I'm so privileged. When I did this research, I got 174 written comments to 320 respondents.
That's not bad.
That's a huge conversion. You got a 1/3 conversion instead of 2%.
Yeah, so 320 people filled out the survey, and then I got, and it was unbelievable to me. I couldn't believe it. People writing in voluminous, varied stories. They wanted to share. This is what
personal connections for sure.
Yeah, and I think it was also a lot of them wrote in, the frustration of a Likert scale. They, it's frustrating to fill in radio buttons. You want to tell your story, and there was so much pent up need to share. Like, and I was the generosity, like there are tens of thousands of words just in those stories alone.
Yes.
And the qualitative interviews that I did were incredibly like moving, personal, intimate. And I want to share those stories with the wider market, with the wider industry and the wider community, because there's ways that we can address and fix them. So for my research philosophy, my goal is really participant action research, which is basically the idea that you're not treating people like, respondents. They're not at arm's length. My focus is always, I try to use indigenous methodologies for my work, where I'm doing a service
Mm-hmm.
to the community, to the people who responded to me. I feel very connected to them. I want to make sure that they're involved at every stage. And with the online survey, they're anonymous, but I really want to make sure I'm reporting back, because this is theirs, right?
Yeah.
So that philosophy of, using, again, an indigenous approach of making sure that this is of service to a
Yeah,
broad
which is very different for anybody out there who was critical of or is critical of the research methodology. You may only understand it from two-tailed t-tests and those types of studies, whereas talking about qualitative analysis is a very different field of study, and it's no less viable and it's no less rigorous. You just have to understand it to understand what that means. Same thing with action research, which is like a subset. And if you want to have those talks, we can have those talks on the Maple Syrup Shop Talk thing. I'd be happy to discuss that with everybody in terms of what methodology actually fits, because the methodology has to
the
fit
type of research you're doing, for sure.
Exactly.
And you know what? And then another,
strange.
and well, yeah, well, that's because some people maybe don't necessarily have the background in understanding the type of different research that you can conduct. Oh, I'm sorry. I was actually going to make a point, but my brain just totally.
That's okay.
Spaced.
When you think about it, let us know.
Shoot.
So,
what were we just talking about?
Action research and giving back to the community that.
Oh, I know what
I
was going to say. I was going to talk about bias, because anyone who actually takes this approach to this quantitative research, where you're trying to make that connection with the person in a lot of ways by not removing yourself, but you're honestly adding yourself, but you're removing yourself at the same time, because what you don't realize is most people, when they only look at numbers, they're not taking anyone else's interpretation of it. So ultimately, they're injecting a lot more of their own personal bias in the interpretation of said numbers. But when now you're looking at them through the lens of the person who gave them to you, ultimately, you're actually correcting for far more of that bias, whether you realize it or not.
Yeah, so with a lot of them it was a disconnected process. So initially what I did was, so there was 3 methodologies I was using, just the talk shop about the dissertation. The first thing that I did was an audit of the game designers. So, working through assessing racial and gender backgrounds of each of the designers, which were involved in an incredible amount of research for the top 400 games. So making sure that I was going through interviews of the designers, how do they self-identify? I also had other coders who were also doing that work. And so they were looking at sections of the coding, doing their own blind from my assessments and seeing what they came up with too. And so we were able to analyze, and we had a Cohen's kappa of 97%. So our conclusions were very similar. So that was the first piece. And then the second piece was the cover art, same process, where I basically did a straight count based on a really strict definitional coding book of how I was coding everything. And the same process applied there, where I had other coders look at the work and assess. And then the online survey was disconnected from that, because people didn't have my research. I wasn't giving them, oh, isn't this terrible? Here are my findings. What do you think about this? I was just asking, does representation matter to you? Does positive representation matter to you? Does it matter to you when you purchase a game, whether the designer is BIPOC or a woman or non-binary? Does that matter? And so I was asking those types of questions, again, disconnected from my findings, just so I wasn't influencing them in any way. I wanted to just approach them, as they are in the board game community right now. What do they think? And what was really, really interesting to me is some of the feedback was, this has been a bothersome thing for me since the beginning. I had people commenting that, if I really sat down and thought about this, I'd be angry all the time. A lot of the feedback that I got, and it was actually, it became its own coding category, was people sharing that they really, really strictly curate their game group, that they've moved away from going to the big public events and their game store. Instead, they curate a very carefully selected group of people that they play with, which was a really, really interesting finding. And so, and then I did qualitative interviews based on the online survey to say, okay, based on what I'm learning from the online survey, let's go a little deeper and let's talk a little bit more about some of the big categories that I was learning from the online survey. So that's how that process worked. And I wanted to make sure that at each stage, I was bleeding as much subjectivity out of it as I possibly could, because I used to do this work for corporations. And so being as strictly adherent to just objective, here's a straight count, I'm not going to make any assessments about it, here you go, these are the numbers. What do you think of that community as I share this research? And here's what people are saying. And again, there was a lot of opportunity in the online survey to have people take a completely contrary opinion. I was trying to, avoid the Hawthorne effect of, I'm not trying to nudge you in a certain direction. There were lots of questions where I said, I have no problem at all in the board gaming community. It's everything's great. There were those types of questions as well. So people could see that I wasn't trying to nudge them in a direction. And then there was a lot of repetition in the survey to see, if there was validated findings.
Yeah. So you like, survey design is super, super important in research to get what you want out of it without coloring the data in a lot of ways.
And also confirming that the person is answering truthfully, because they said the same thing more than once. Yes, which can happen too, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So what in the research was the most surprising thing you found, and what was the least surprising thing you found?
That's a really good question. I actually had, it's really interesting. And I know people initially when I submitted my first study, I was actually very surprised by the numbers not being better than they were. I had a very, very, I think I had a very optimistic view. And Erica, just to your really good point, I had so many games that I had purchased that were designed by women, designed by Black, Indigenous, people of color. I think I curated my own collection on that basis. So I thought, the numbers are going to be okay. They're going to be good.
Very, very, very narrow. Yeah.
I actually had this incredibly optimistic hypothesis. Mm-hmm. And when the numbers came back, I kept thinking, this can't be right. And so I checked and I rechecked and I hired coders with my own money to make sure that I wasn't getting it wrong, because my hypothesis going in, because I had sort of viewed, my board gaming community, my board gaming stores, my collection, my Kickstarters as being quite good. And I had read that Aaron Ryan Cardboard Republic thing, the amazing, you're more likely to see a sheep than a woman study. And I thought, maybe we've gotten better, and that was my original premise, was we're probably a lot better now because things are getting better. Right. And I had this super optimistic view, and then the numbers came back and they were not great at all. In fact, they were chillingly bad. Mm-hmm. And what's also difficult for me, as you saw, during the Bradley Tabletop Symposium, I compare the 2018 numbers with the numbers I got for the larger sample, and they're not better.
Right. And that's what I was just going to ask you, actually, just tell us.
Yeah, everyone hopes for the improvement, but I at least worked on the games behind me, so I have a connection. But it's interesting how you almost don't feel like you have the option of choosing sometimes. Like if you're going, like if I was going to go back stuff on Kickstarter right now, it doesn't, if I want a game that happens to be a game that looks like something you'd actually play, odds are I can't focus that much on what's on the box art. Right. There's a lot of things where that becomes a luxury.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's kind of the truth of the situation, is that, and I get that, a lot of people are buying the games because of the game and the gameplay and all that kind of stuff. And so it's seen as this luxury to have diversification and identity and all these representations that we claim to support on the box cover and inside the game itself.
Look at the insane reaction to just what happened with Tiny Epic. And
Right.
that was just like correcting, you know, clothing posture, whatever it was going to be. They weren't even objecting to this, but it was like the world objected for them. It was insanity.
Yeah, and then the reaction from the community, or a very small but vocal part of the community, in regards to Isaac Childress's statement of, you know, cultural sensitivity. And we see all these things happen.
And you wonder why the numbers don't get any better. It's because anyone who announces that they're working on it gets slaughtered for it.
Right. And Amy is saying, what a bummer, in regards to that there's not a lot of positive change. And then she says, thank you for your work, Tanya. It's so important. So
Very nice.
So both of those were surprising and unsurprising at the same time, that stuff didn't change very much in, you know, the 2-3 years. And a lot of the top 100, top 200 really, is historically similar. Like you can see a lot of those games that they're going to stay there for quite a while based on just propensity of data. And the problem with that is that when you have that much data stacked up against some of the newer entries, it's really hard for some of the newer entries that aren't blasting away at things like Gloomhaven or Pandemic Legacy 1 Season 1 did, for them to make the top 400 can be difficult. It's not impossible.
Well, they're not going to get those instant 10,000 reviews. Like the way that a lot of the algorithms work is, even to be on the hotness list is how much someone is looking up your game on top of other factors. So if you're brand new and nobody's discovered you yet, or you don't have that celebrity behind you, you already don't register. It's how any algorithm system works.
Yeah. And then the problem is that when the algorithm works that way, and we could go have a whole conversation about the weapons of math destruction. But the idea that like even stores, like I know lots of stores that do this, they'll just say, hey, I don't know what to buy. Just give me a case of everything in the top 10.
Yeah. Give me that must-have staple games kind of thing.
And so then those games just become even more popular, again, based on data and propensity of data. So it's going to be challenging for a lot of the games to break into that unless they have both amazing gameplay, and then they also have, the representation and stuff that we are hoping for in the future. We being the three of us. I can't speak to everybody out there.
We're trying, guys. I swear
kind of
to God,
assuming that most of you are like that as well. Because if you haven't asked me yet about my feminist agenda, you can totally do that.
Is the button ask me about my feminist agenda?
Yeah. And I'm sure most of the people watching know that is something. Tanya, did you want to show any of the slides?
Absolutely.
Yeah, let's bring that into the stream.
Okay, that's great.
1 second. There we go. Actually, you know what? I'm going to solo it so everybody can see it big, and you won't see our faces, but you can still hear us.
You don't need to see our faces. This is more interesting. No.
Yeah, so one of the things that I talked about in the Bradley Tabletop, and I'm actually doing the PhD, the graduate student conference circuit right now. So I'm actually presenting my findings to a number of academic conferences and garnering feedback from my peers right now. And one of the things that, I talked about is the fact that I worked a lot with corporations. My job was to build essentially dashboards for companies to help them kind of look at the marketplace, what was going on, some of the levers, and create these corporate dashboards for companies. And this was kind of one of the motivations for me doing this work. And just as you talked about weapons of math destruction, business leaders, particularly as an audience, really privilege numeracy. More than they like hearing anecdotes and what could be outliers. They really want statistics. They want trends. And so, there's a whole Postman thing here about, we're technopolies, Canada, US. We're a technopoly that really privileges numeracy, numbers, hard facts, technology. And, I talk a little bit about just my process with the PhD dissertation and my different measures, just to Erica's really good question, that there was a bunch of different things. I'm just going to skip through some of the questions, but it really was focused on, does this delimit board gaming's growth, both as a cultural practice and as an industry? And I really wanted to figure out, and sort of the brass tacks of it, like, how does this impact whether people purchase and play the games, and then does it impact them in the spaces where gaming is practiced? And I think that's one of the really interesting things here. And I picked Board Game Geek, the top 400. What's also really interesting, I wish I had this chart, was, Sen, to your really good point, these aren't older games though necessarily. So my database poll was in June of 2020. I looked at the top 400 games, and this is an incredibly laborious process. This took me months and months of coders looking and checking my work. So, this was the upshot, that we had, a propensity of white men creating these games. Again, they're actually newer games, so 5 years and newer. And this is the kind of the split. So 92.6% were designed by white men. And that makes you question, so there's the big finding, that white men were predominantly responsible for that top 400 Board Game Geek. And this is how it kind of nets out in just the straight numbers of it, with 6 BIPOC men and 583 designers. So I'm really wanting to look at, and a lot of this, as you can see, a lot of it's repeats. A lot of the same people, the same players are responsible for that top 400. And then, my 2018 study really looked at, just the top 200, and the finding there was 93.5% white male designers. So, typically in doing this work, when I would do these audits for companies and do environmental scans, when you see a labor market that's this skewed, it's something's happening there, in terms of, the way people are recruited and hired. And it's so that the labor is very, very, very focused on white men. And so my first question was, is the demography of the top 400 Board Game Geek designers diverse? And the answer, of course, is no. And I'm going to skip through these, but these are just some other studies that I really used as inspiration, pertinent to us. We're all teachers. This was a study that was done recently, 2018, about how many readings are assigned in university courses. This is the Paris Institute of Political Studies. And, 3.5% BIPOC individuals, the readings assigned for courses, and 15.45% women. So it's really pervasive. It's everywhere. It's across every industry. I do a lot of work with Wikipedia, and only 17% of all Wikipedia biographies are about women. So there's a lot here, and this was a study recently. 2/3 of all archaeology doctoral students are women, and one-third, they don't get jobs in tenure track. So they're only 1/3 of the hires for tenure track positions in archaeology. It was just a recent study, and I thought it was interesting. And this is kind of a systemic challenge that a lot of industries are facing. I just wanted to make sure that board gamers understand that this is a pervasive issue across a lot of different sectors. And so, the big upshot here, with the cover art, was 76.8% of the human representation in these games was male, so 76.8%, and 23.2% were women, female presenting girls, women, for that board game artwork. And 82.5% of all of that artwork was white presenting, as opposed to Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, at only 17.5%. And I think that what's really, really interesting there, so these are just the numbers and the counts, and then you do that comparison, and there weren't more sheep than women in this instance, but there were more creatures that don't exist. So aliens, fantastic creatures. There were fewer women represented than orcs, imps, dragons, and aliens in the representation.
Things that you cannot tell their gender.
Yeah, exactly. And I counted literally everything, any fauna, any human representation. I didn't count inanimate objects. I just counted representation. And my advisor actually said, why are you counting individual, dogs? Why do you count individual birds? And I said, just, I wanted to have a comparison. So I have some of these breakouts and I can say, okay, there's more birds than BIPOC women, for example.
By more than double.
Yeah, exactly. And, more horses than BIPOC women. And BIPOC women, I was so shocked by this because, again, I think I'm, going through the world with a really optimistic view and thinking there must be more than this. And I kept counting and recounting. There's only 35 representations of BIPOC women. And, the other thing that was important to me is I decoupled negative versus positive because I'm a white cis woman, and I wanted to save that for another project so I could get a much more crowdsourced perspective on, is this over-sexualized? Is this negative representation? I wanted a much more diverse group of people to help me assess that together. So I want to work with some co-authors, co-respondents to help create that research, because that's over and above this.
Very interesting in itself. Yeah, there's representation, and then there's, is it positive or negative representation?
And, my own,
you're right,
is it's not particularly positive at all. And that's just me, and that's out of scope for this dissertation, but it is something I very much want to work on because the representation
there's more.
It's not great.
Yeah, that is really important to talk about because there is so many people like asking questions or saying things like, well, at least you're on the cover. Isn't that great? It's like, I mean,
what are we doing on the cover?
Yeah,
though?
Right. Exactly. So I think there needs to be positive representation about things. I know a lot of my friends who are Black will often complain in, Black History Month. The Black History Month is more than just slavery, right? Because
you can't.
We're done with seeing Black and brown bodies being enslaved.
Can we see some sort of positive figure?
Exactly.
Right? It's like show the advancement, not the being pulled back.
No, and we're never going to forget the history. That's not what's going to happen.
No, so. Yeah, you want to talk about everything that's great that comes out of it because it was such, recognize the bad and then recognize the strength that comes from the good.
Exactly. And, one of the things that I explore in the dissertation is, the particularly urban purchasing centers of North America. And I kind of look at the biggest cities, the urban centers of North America and in Canada. And, giving it's kind of my this is what I would put in a dashboard for a corporation and saying basically that, you're kind of missing something, that these are the different breakdowns of these urban consumer centers. If you want to think very cynically about dollars and cents, New York City, for example, is 57.27% Black, Indigenous, person of color, 42.73% white, biggest consumer, hub in the world.
And you're saying half your consumers aren't even the people you're targeting.
Exactly. And so, similarly here in Toronto, where I'm located, this is the breakdown. And you can say that there's an incredibly vital, rich, board game community here in Toronto. And a lot of these publishers may be operating under a real misunderstanding about what their audience looks like. And what they want. And one of the things that I think was quite arresting, and I got a lot of visceral feedback back from my Bradley Tabletop Symposium presentation, was just the dollars and cents of other audits that have been done, saying this is in film, where a film that has a $159 million budget will lose $32.2 million on opening weekend. This is before the pandemic, because it lacked authentically inclusive representation. So when the representation is stereotypical and negative, they're leaving this much money on the table because people are going, ugh, that turns me off. I'm not interested.
That is a lot of money.
A lot of money. And over the course of its run, the analysis that was done by Higginbotham, Phil Zeng, and Ulyss said that you can lose as much as 80% of your budget.
That's crazy when you think of, most people don't understand this, but If a movie doesn't at least double its budget, like,
Yep.
so whatever they put in, if it doesn't at least double that, it's not even considered to have made anything.
Exactly. And so, you know,
So-
and this is another thing I would put in a corporate dashboard if, you know, I should be so lucky to advise board game publishers. This is really, really concerning stuff. So, you know, the online survey, and again, exactly right, Erica, it was a qualitative survey, and I was looking for diversity. I wanted to hear from not the saturated base of white men, white middle-class men, although they were welcome to fill out the survey. And you can see from the numbers, quite a large percentage did fill out the survey. Nobody was excluded whatsoever, but I was recruiting for diversity. And again, for the reasons I've shared. And I promoted it on Twitter, Board Game Geek, and Reddit. What was fascinating to me was the lion's share of the participation was on Board Game Geek. And what is really, really interesting about that, so I got 174 voluminous stories from people, 320 respondents. The survey was long, and it was long for a reason. I wanted to make sure that I was asking questions in different ways, so people weren't being sort of led to water a particular conclusion. I also wanted to make sure that I minimized any griefing, any weird behavior, any spam bots, anything like that. So 40 minutes to complete. It was a very long study with a lot of repetition. I got 15,402 words back in terms of storytelling, which should tell you how invested people felt about this. And I got a really fascinating diversity of gender representation. Here's a breakdown. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but you know, cis men, 77 participants. The majority of the participation was at 175, 175 cis women, trans women, non-binary, gender fluid. Lots and lots of diversity in gender representation. I really wanted a much larger percentage of Black, Indigenous, person of color. But I got 20.4%. So this was self-identification. And I asked it in a bunch of different ways, allowing people to write in their own identification rather than providing radio buttons. This was another example of that, where I let people write in their sexual orientation, their racial identification, and gender identification. And what is also really, really interesting, this is something that I hypothesized about completed education. And I did get back something that kind of confirmed a hypothesis that I had, which is that it's the level of education of avid board gamers, at least in this sample, was way higher than population averages. So you can see that, 6.9% had PhDs. Only 4.5% of the US population have PhDs, and only 0.88% in Canada. So, what's fascinating to me is about 80% of the sample had completed some post-secondary education. So a very educated audience. And here's just a little breakdown. And what was really, really gratifying to me too, and I really wanted to get this from the work, was 52.8% identified as LGBTQ plus. 78%, 78.9% were in a relationship with another person or persons, and 81.8% completed some form of post-secondary education. So what you're getting back here, and what was also really interesting to me, is my intentional diversity recruitment actually had it align rather nicely with population stats. So a referential sample should align somewhat to Canadian or US population stats. That was my goal. And what I found was I was only a few percentage points off population, which I thought was really, really interesting in terms of a finding. And the other thing too is, 58.5% rather had household incomes higher than $50,000 a year. And what was also super fascinating, this diverse sample, is 70.7% gamed at least once a week, so super committed. And a really, really interesting stat, 53.5% had been in the hobby for more than 11 years. So this whoosh of kind of, I think outrage is a fair comment, about the diversity of my sample that I got from almost all corners. So on the negative side of things, I got lots of great feedback too, was that, this was a too diverse sample, and they're not the right kind of gamers. You didn't talk to the right kind of people. And
so
that
this was feedback you were given?
Yes.
Yes.
Online.
Wow.
And I think I wrote
I would love to know what the quote unquote and very big quote unquote right type of gamer is.
But that's exactly what Sen and Erica, you've been talking about, which is this idea that, and it's often, it's coded like this is mainstream, this is AAA, this is, of primary concern to us, this is our market. And that default understanding of who's a person, who's the default human, what do we build products for? And in many industries, the answer is white men. Right. And that's a very stark reality that I learned in life sciences, in tech, that the typical user, imagined user, is not a woman, is not somebody of color. It is a white male. And that is the primary, and it's an ideological orientation. And it pervades every industry.
I'm wondering how much all the recent data is now suggesting that more than 50% of the consumer group for games in general is female. Like they've reached over the 50% mark.
Yeah, it's like 51.
Yes.
Yeah. So if it's like, okay, wait a second, they just passed more than half your consumer base, you're not even targeting. I'm really curious to see where this is going to go.
Well, I mean, Tanya and I had this discussion online on Twitter about how both of us feel that marketing is, and you and I have talked about this extensively, Erica, that marketing in the board game industry is really not great. And they're shouting at that people. It's like preaching to the choir, right? And then
they're already buying it.
Effectively market, you have to go and find new markets.
Yes, it takes time and money. But it's interesting because obviously they're out there. And I'll say, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm an oddball in terms of being a female designer in the game industry, but I'm not an oddball in that I'm the primary game purchaser in my house.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. And, that is an interesting point. And something that Mick and Starla from Our Family Plays Games talked about as well, and I couldn't agree with this more, is look at video games. Erica, exactly to your point. The average video game or digital game player is a middle-aged woman, right? Yeah. From a marketing perspective. Now, how do we define games? How do we define digital games? And what's super, super fascinating to me is, that Jesper Jewell, a book about the casual revolution, games are becoming incredibly integrated into our lives. And because of that shift, different types of games in digital spaces have actually brought in more users, more community.
Especially daily users, I would say. For sure.
Yeah, and I mean, we can talk about the. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
I was gonna say that we can look at all the the awful psychology behind some of the driving factors in making those games addictive to people.
We'll ignore
that for now.
For those things, yes.
But the advent of having something as powerful as a smartphone in your pocket that you can play on, and it's this thing that people who might be otherwise engaged in cooking and cleaning and caring for children, no matter what gender you are, you can go and play that for a little bit and a little bit at a time. Do one level of a game and then put it down. It's just revolutionized how games are played, and thus I think has opened up the marketplace to who can be considered a gamer now. Not that we should ever really be gatekeeping that, but the facts are the facts.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And I think that, you look at the progression of video games, which, Erica, to your point, are not necessarily doing it, they're not doing maybe a great job of really marketing actively, but they certainly have moved their audience to a place where, again, the average gamer is a middle-aged woman. And I think that, board gaming is still kind of mired in that first client I talked about that was really, really, well, that's not our audience. We do things differently here. We're really focused on the true users of computing technology. We're not going to worry about anybody else. And that company doesn't exist anymore. And I think that one of the things, I actually tweeted this at Jason Perez when he did that interview with Isaac Childress on Frosthaven, and I said, frankly, this kind of effort, hiring an editor, hiring a cultural editor, is just good business.
It is.
This is a finding that I was really shocked by, where you often don't see with Likert scale models or those types of questions the strongly agree taking this lion's share. So strongly agree was 60.4%. Positive racial and gender representation in a game enhances my enjoyment when playing a game. Who wants to design a game that is less enjoyable to...
You're right. Usually people will just click agree because they're like, yeah, I agree with that statement. But the idea of clicking strongly agree says that you have conviction behind that agreement.
Yeah, and I mean,
yeah,
that's really interestingly representative of
disagree is interesting too.
Yeah, of what's not in there, what's not in the game, right? So it would make it so much better if is maybe also part of it. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think that one of the other really interesting things about this, I actually brought this up just as a funny aside, because I do get a lot of negative feedback to my work from a very small and vocal contingent of people. And this was actually, I thought this was really funny that the Daily Caller actually picked up my previous study way back when, and I thought they got this right. Board games don't do enough to reflect the diversity of America's population. I thought, oh, that's a really good headline. The story itself was not great, but the headline was spot on. So I thought that they got that right that one time. And I think the other thing is there's a real dark side to the hobby, as we're sort of alluding to super fast, that people felt like they were being treated differently because of their gender identity. And Erica, one of the things that was so interesting too was each of the questions that I asked, many people wrote in long stories about why they answered the way they did. And I thought that was
I feel like we all have those stories. Do you know what I mean? Because if you answered like a very simple agree or disagree to all your statements, I bet you there's a correlation to the length of story you attributed at the end. But anybody who clicked any of the strong feeling buttons, shall we say, probably had quite the story to tell you.
Exactly. And I really want to make sure that I'm honoring those stories and I'm sharing them in a way that is as responsible and as loudly as I possibly can, in that I think these stories need to be understood and told, because we need to make these spaces where gaming is practiced a lot safer. So 1 in 3 reported unwelcome sexual advances when participating in the board gaming hobby. Again, lots of write-in comment. 1 in 3 said and I heard from so many people that said, I don't engage in board game topics online because I'm scared.
Especially as female, you mean? Female identifying, at least?
It was a real mix.
Or just in general? Yeah,
a real mix. And what was interesting is there was the crosstabs on that were all over in terms of identification. They just don't want to engage because they and a lot of people wrote in long stories about really toxic culture, incivility in the hobby, and I was looking at all kinds of different dimensions to this. And, again, these stories, there's so many stories, and so this is alarm bell stuff for me, looking at corporate health. And, 1 in 3 say that they avoid participating in public gaming events. That was before the pandemic. So these are all really, really delimiting stuff for the market.
Yeah. When you talk about money left on the table,
yes,
that's 1 out of every 3 board gamers that could be coming to your convention aren't, because they are not feeling comfortable. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a bad deal. Very bad operational things happening on many levels here.
Yeah, exactly. And the stories, this one story, a lot of it really resonates with me, because I've been in those spaces, not always particularly welcoming. We really curate now where we go when it comes to board gaming. Again, pre-pandemic, we don't leave our house right now. But there's stories like this one where it's when I see that there are no other women in the store, I just walk by, because I've had so many bad experiences, trying to play Friday Night Magic, for example.
I was gonna say collectible card games. I think I've heard this the most from participants when they walk by and they do not look like the people in there will be inviting to them, even though it's one-on-one. You know, there shouldn't be any of this us versus them thing, but there still is. I know I'm in a very unique situation because at least I have confidence as like, you guys are playing like games of people I know. Like I'm in a very weird position, but most people will go, you're very intimidating. I don't like how you're talking to me. Like anyone who's listened to me enough, how many times have I told stories of like, how many people's girlfriend have I had to be by this point? Like I can't be the designer. I can't be their friend. I have to be someone's girlfriend.
That's right.
It's like, no, but that's, if that is what's so common, if the only thing you can be there is to be there for a guy,
Yes,
you're going to find it very hard to be included.
exactly.
Or even want to be.
Right.
Yeah, because
Like the desire just sort of dies.
Yeah.
Like I really would love to ask a lot of the people who are so against all this stuff, or who actually say, well, I can walk in any game store and feel comfortable. How come you can't? I would like to ask them about, hey, let's go to a hip hop show
Go to a gay club
and see how would you feel? Oh, I'd be fine. Would you really? I don't know.
Yeah.
We have some questions from the audience and hopefully
Sure.
some more coming up. By the way, this is the most quiet our audience has ever been in a very long time.
Listening. I think they're
Oh,
listening.
no. That's the reason why they say we want to
Yeah.
talk, but this is riveting stuff. So Paul Saxberg asks, do you plan to look into neurodiversity, sexual orientation, or anything else as your next step? What's your next step is basically his question.
You know, I would really love to do that. That's a really so one of the things I actually had some folks asking online about, you know, coding for like narrative against like the character. So one just exactly, Paul, to your point, you know, Arkham Horror, the card game, Nikki Valens shared in interviews that a lot of the characters that are represented in that game are LGBTQ, right? But it's, you know, and so they asked, you know, did you code the cover art on that basis? And you can't, because a lot of the cover art doesn't necessarily have a narrative. But I think that would be very, very interesting to do. And the other thing is around accessibility, because it's a super important area. And, you know, like Meeples Like Us, the work that they've done, I really find so important that you need that kind of that's a step that in a professionalized sector you would absolutely do, to say, okay, let's do an accessibility teardown on this design, as well as a cultural sensitivity read. It's part of the professionalization process to say, we've got to fix this, we got to bring more people in. And, you know, is it offensive on all of these different dimensions? Because that's good business. That's what corporate Canada, that's what corporate US is like. If they're not doing it, then they're in trouble, right? It's just professionalization.
And definitely like owning up to it if it's not, and or being very not blatant about it, but saying, yes, this isn't for that. And sometimes that's okay. You can't make dexterity games that everybody is going to be able to play.
Yes.
That's understandable.
But you can't take that stance as a company.
No.
That's where the difference becomes.
Yeah. It's the difference between saying that and you know, actually approaching it from a sensitive point of view. Eric asks, do you find that analyzing data gathered from BGG rankings is both an analysis of gaming trends at large and what the BGG audience values?
You know, that's a really good question. I got that a ton. You know, why do you think Board Game Geek is a good place to start? So a lot of, you know, and whatever the motivation is for asking that question, a lot of people were like, why didn't you look at mass market games? Why didn't you look at top selling games? Because top selling games are a very different animal.
Yeah.
I really wanted to look at hobby board gaming as a cultural practice. So my focus was really looking at Board Game Geek. And what ended up happening was it's kind of an interesting closed community of Board Game Geek users who are actually weighing in. So I didn't intend that, but what ended up happening is most of the people who participated in the survey, all Board Game Geek profiles, all people who are engaged with Board Game Geek. And the other thing that was really interesting about that, just as an aside, is that too diverse sample that I created that was outraged some people. These are Board Game Geek, you know, they're the Board Game Geek bros that you're talking about.
Yeah, this is the market.
But they're women, but they're trans, you know, men, women, they're non-binary. They have all of these different ways of identifying. They have Board Game Geek profiles. So that it ended up being almost a little bit of like a community assessment of Board Game Geek. And I think people were really surprised to see that level of diversity in that community. And again, I went on Reddit, I went on Twitter, I spread the survey far and wide. I got the most traffic on Board Game Geek. And so I didn't look at mass market games because I was really looking for the designer games, right? If I'm going to assess, the labor of games, a lot of mass market games disappear the designer, right?
Yes.
And I think that I'm looking at a cultural practice. I'm looking at a particular slice of gaming, and you have to define your terms very carefully when you set that up in the dissertation. And there are many pages to explain that, that kind of selection process.
And in the field of like designer games where we have that representation of the designer, and that's part of the whole selling point ostensibly of this field.
At least.
Yeah, where it's elevated a little more towards the art level of things than the pimple popping game in or whatever, the poop in the toilet game, which are all games. They're all games. It's just, is the artistry the same? And the answer would probably be no.
Yeah.
Well, I was to say, even internally, like the companies would treat them differently, because now what you're talking about, those are patent games, which is a very, very different thing from hobby games.
That's right. Exactly.
Ian O'Toole is saying that neurodiversity, would be super interesting to see how the common myths of gaming align with reality. It's also a section of the audience that isn't often treated well in an industry that still uses madness mechanisms liberally. Right?
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. And I think that's the entirety of this push, starting with racial and gender diversity and representation in games, is that this is meant to embrace. Like, I actually talk in the dissertation, there's a section where you have to talk about limitations. And Ian, that is one of them that I actually identified, because I had a lot of people approaching me talking about disability, talking about neurodiversity, and again, that culture, that a gaming culture as it currently stands, that really excludes a whole lot of people on all kinds of different dimensions, and again, going back to those early tech metaphors, that company that no longer exists that I talked about, they had the same kind of snobbery about no one, the great unwashed can't possibly
understand what it is we do.
They won't want this computer thing,
or we don't really want them to want it. To be fair,
who needs more than 64K of RAM?
Exactly. And, they literally had a president that famously said, I can't imagine why anyone would ever want a computer in his home, right?
Because they're fun.
Yeah, exactly. And if everyone had thought that way, we would not be carrying a computer in our pocket, right?
Yes.
So I think that a lot of you're really delimiting your growth when you focus in on this, get good, hardcore, masculine, toxic performative, masculine exclusion club. And I have a colleague that I adore who talks about gaming's cultural clubhouse. And, there was a lot of, no girls allowed. There's a lot of just exclusion. And you're constantly, her name is Dr. Emma Voss, and she's incredible. And she talks a lot about just peering in that window of the cultural clubhouse and not being allowed in. And that happens it happened in video game spaces for years and years. It's getting better. But yeah, our family plays games. Hello, you were amazing. I love you so much. And yes, that's exactly right. And you guys do it better than almost anyone. You remind me so much of those early PC. They used to hire people. They were evangelists, and they would rove around the country, spreading the word about personal computing. And they understood scaffolding, like easing people in, getting them, meeting them where they're at, and getting them fascinated by something. Starting.
It's what we call grassroots. The people who don't understand marketing and don't understand how you get these people. This is what grassroots marketing is. We'll say, like, just for the people in the back.
Yeah. Exactly
there's so much to unpack here in terms of the inclusion, in terms of marketing, in terms of all the stuff that you're talking about, and how do we get people that should, by most metrics, be interested in gaming at some level, and probably are playing games at some level, we just don't know it, and what types of games, and doing all that kind of stuff. Games are fundamentally part of the human condition.
We can't help it.
We start learning through games, whether it's peekaboo or anything like that, still a game. And the idea that there are non-gamers, or that there are people who don't fit into the gamer mold or mentality, or not hardcore enough or whatever, is pretty patently false. There might be people who don't enjoy them as much, but they can still play games.
Look at the people who, like, I mean, just the long history of ragging on a Monopoly, and I feel like we're only just getting the turn of people being like, but why?
Why are you ragging on Monopoly?
Yeah, isn't that most people's, like, a literal gateway game to everything else?
Yeah.
Why are you ragging on the stepping stone? Just let them play.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
You may not like it, and that's okay.
No,
but
we
they
all
do, and
played
that's
it. We all
okay.
went beyond it because we enjoyed gaming and wanted more variety, the same way, you know, you don't watch the same movies over and over again. But if someone told you that they absolutely loved, like, some super classic movie, what are you going to do? Rag on them like, oh, you do hate movies? Like, we have the wrong approach, people. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, and it's about delimiting your growth. When you have those kinds of encounters, when you encounter that level of toxicity, that gatekeeping, you walk away. And what I got back from my survey were people that, despite it all, still persevered. And to Sen's excellent point, everybody wants to game. Everybody does. A lot of us don't have the privilege, the time. They're not being welcomed in, and they can't do it. And that actually does a lot of negative social. It has a negative social impact.
Yes.
Dr. Kishonna Gray talks a lot about gaming literacies as the 21st century skill. And it teaches you literacies that you're going to need in the work world. We're excluding people from that literacy. And that's a social problem. So, you know, with this research, I'm talking to the money, but there is a knock-on social impact to barring people from gaming spaces. And
I'm going to add a really small anecdote because it's something I've actually been tracking over the last little while. So I play a fun little, CCG game online called Runeterra. And everything for me, I actually just put Erica. Okay. I gave up a long time ago, pretending I was not a girl or whatever it was on Spaces. I'm like, whatever. I'm Erica. Erica on everything. I've been tracking the number of surrenders that happen at certain points in a game rather than finishing a game, or if there's any type of, like, let's say I have a very early lead. I've been tracking the number of surrenders that happen, and I'm actually hoping to compare them to someone who's not female at some point to see, because I actually record them now too, to be like, no, I just want to show you, like, I've only been playing for 30 minutes. I'm at like about 6 or 7 surrenders at this point. Is that average? And so imagine if all of that, and that's just one tiny example, imagine all of that building up every single day, all the time.
Yes.
Right.
And so, I mean, lots of people don't like the word microaggression because they don't understand it. And that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Is these things that just add up over time.
I'm saying they're surrendering because they don't want to lose to a girl. Is
yes,
effectively what exactly. It's anyone who's not getting that. And it seems to happen at a somewhat over rate, in my opinion, based on whether or not I've been Erica on things, or if I've been something that's gender ambiguous.
Interesting.
So anyway, it's something I'm watching.
And that's actually something that Dr. Kishonna Gray does. She looked at mainly Black women gamers on Xbox, mainly on, massive multiplayer worlds. And what she found is exactly what you found statistically, that when you present as female as Black, you will more likely be, you will have more griefing behaviors. Your teammates might attack you more when you're doing sort of guild missions. You will have more profanity. You will have more situations like, bad sportsmanship, but worse, where like surrenders or giving up or leaving the game. She actually does a really, really intensive audit of those experiences and does the same kind of, I model a lot of the work that I'm doing on the way she approached it, where she looked at things from a numeracy perspective and then got a lot of qualitative feedback back.
Right. Which is important. Yeah, the numbers are only one part of the story.
So if anyone's a player at some point, that is a male presenting at least player or ambiguous,
Also
you play Runeterra.
Specifically Runeterra.
Well, I say Runeterra just because it's, at least for somewhat a faceless CCG game, but at the same time, you still have a name. Because I don't have to even make a character, right? I'm not even presenting as a character in this game. I'm just a name. I would love to know what other people's experience are, because I a couple other players, and I have to say, from what I get, theirs is not the same experience, and they're all male. So
you're saying, Erica, that you get a lot more people who will grind to the end?
No, what they'll do is if I have an advantage, or if it looks like I'm going to win, rather than wait it out, they will surrender.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because even in Runeterra, there's kind of like a known thing when you play, like a certain sticker that you put up to be like, you got me, right? Sort of thing. And at the very least, you give that, right? There's like, there is, there's manners, shall we say, to any type of online game system.
Yeah.
And so, you put up, good game kind of thing. You got me, or, I know I've got you next round. There is a very clear culture of how you play if you're going to surrender, if you know you're got whatever it is.
Right. So they're not going through those patterns of behavior that are
they'll wait out their turn trying to figure something out till it red lines out. And then all of a sudden they surrender, and you're like, but why?
But do they scoop and go, or do they at least put up the sticker? I don't know Runeterra,
no. No, that's the thing. They won't
so
say
even
the
social cultural norms. The social cultural norms of the games are not followed because potentially you're female presenting.
And that's where I'm curious.
You know what? I will absolutely send out a link. I'll tweet it out. Kishonna Gray talks about this very issue, Erica. And, it's actually related to something that Paul Saxberg just said in the chat. So Paul, that's you're talking about uninterested in playing games because their words not mine, don't like to be made to feel stupid. That's something that Kishonna Gray talks a lot about too, and a lot of the literature I look at. It's called stereotype threat, where, and this happens a lot, where you're afraid to look stupid. And there's actually a lot of very structured studies that have been done where you'll tell a group of women, men always score better on this particular activity, like a math quiz, and women do worse as a result of being told that. And similarly, there's been studies about race, and it will actually sway the results of people who are evenly matched because they're told, women are traditionally really bad at this. Or, and the studies themselves are very interesting. They've been done sort of longitudinally. And it's this idea of stereotype threat. You do not want to look stupid. So, in fact, this actually has prevented me from playing and engaging in games in my past if I know it's a very unwelcoming group, because I don't want to deal with that. And, I really, actually, one of the questions that came up, and I really want to, our Family Plays Games asked a really, really important question. How do we convince publishers and designers to look at this research? And I am really going to I'm trying to do the rounds, do this tour, and really focus. I'm going to try and publish this in a bunch of open journals. I've made that strategic decision because I don't care if I'm in a prestigious journal that's behind a paywall. What good does that do anyone? So I very intentionally I'm posting this in an open forum because I really, really want this research to become available to everybody. I'm actually doing an event next week with Eric Lang and Mandy Hutchinson with Asmodee. And I am sharing with them, I've given, Asmodee all of my research, or a good portion of it. And we're going to be talking about RPGs specifically on June 11th. And I'm going to tweet that information out too. But that, my focus, my goal is to give this to the community, to give back to the people who told me their stories, and make sure that people listen, because it's really important.
Yeah, Candace is saying that we see the same thing in education. If a student doesn't see themselves in the course content, the faculty or staff, facilities, then it can be really discouraging and limiting. I experience that all the time in my faculty as well. Mick and Starler is saying sometimes they have non-POC players play very differently with them as African Americans. So... and then, but if you play against Starla, you're probably going to lose anyway. Doesn't matter. Very good, very good. So yeah, there's a lot going on here, everyone. And I
Very
really,
enmeshed,
yeah, it's excellent information to kind of sift over, let yourself sit with it for like a couple days. Tanya, sorry, is available on Twitter at Pobuda, and you can also check out her academic website at Tanya Pobuda, phd.wordpress.com. And if you get involved with Tanya on Twitter, just tag me in there as well. I love everything that she's talking about, so I want to be involved and I want to see what she's saying, because it's really enlightening to think about the industry from a different perspective. I spent so much time thinking about it from the game design perspective that all these other aspects of it, I think, enrich how I approach that. Do you agree, Erica?
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree, because I mean, we talk about all the time. Half the time when we're playing, we're looking for the experience. The experience is the psychology of the player.
Yeah.
How are they interacting with the game, right? And we're not really looking at the mechanics at that point, because at that point, it's like, if I'm going to correct a mechanic, it's because of the behavior that came out of it. Once again, I'm back to the psych side of it. I think you do the exact same thing. And you know what? A lot of this is really interesting based on that, what we were kind of talking about potentially for the ludology episode, about the psychology of the player.
Right. Yeah. Oh, and Tanya, we will grab you for a ludology episode soon as well. Just
We
so
were
you
talking
know.
about the psych behind a lot of these decisions. Would might be a really fascinating
cool.
approach.
That's so cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you have any more questions, Paul is saying that's the Instagram. So that Twitter is. Oh, okay.
And that says Paul checked it out. So good job, Paul.
See, good job, Paul.
I'm so bad at Instagram. If I haven't replied to you on Instagram, it's because I'm terrible at it. But yes, I'm better on Twitter. So much better.
I'm terrible at Instagram.
Yeah. You had a run. You had a run. Remember last
I know
year?
it still works without me, so I'm okay with it. But
there you go.
Every once in a while, it's mostly like, I think it's nothing but Scott Pilgrim and Rat Queens, but there's still like at least 500 something people following it. So
there you go.
Apparently, I don't have to do anything.
So at Pobuda Tanya. There you go. Good job. Thank you, Paul, for correcting us. That's wonderful. If you want to talk to myself, and I am at Senfeng Lim on Twitter. Erica, where are you?
At Erica Bouyeris.
And Jesse is at TT Void. They actually turned on their Twitter this morning to look at something, so you never know. If you tweet,
can we get
Jess,
Jesse back for maybe the last couple episodes or something?
We'll try.
Be nice.
They're not here. They're just real busy up north. And the time switch is very weird.
I know the time switch is weird. It'd just be, I mean, I miss Jesse's face, but it'd be nice to see.
Yeah, we'll try to get them back on. Cool. And again, if you'd like to support this show and what we do, we are available on Patreon at patreon.com/maple syrup, and support us at any level. We would appreciate it greatly. And now, Erica, that cons are starting to roll out, we need to start planning on what we're going to do.
Yeah.
When we start going. Yeah.
Our still hope was, because not only are we hoping to have like people serve at certain cons, right? Because then we actually get to talk to the people who are there, talk to the new designers. They get to actually tell us about, like, practice their pitch. We do all those kind of things, right, when we're there. We also kind of wanted to start seeing if we could help sponsor people in small ways. So we know how expensive cons are. We know how hard it is to get there. We not only hopefully have some financing through Patreon, but, you know, we also have our connections. So our hope, maybe 2022, because God knows what the hell this year is about, we might be able to actually start arranging things for, like, can we give tickets away? Can we, even if, things like that.
Yeah, there's ways to do a lot of this stuff. Next week, just before we get to final advice, I know I told you that would be final advice time, but I just want to say next week, maybe Ian O'Toole. Haha, that'll be awesome. Yeah. And just want to say,
okay. Here's our idea, because maybe people actually have some other people they want to come in. The idea for next week's topic was this idea of this expansion of the one-time play game. So, you know, it's kind of like we've got the rebirth of all of these murder mysteries, or the, you know, the murder in the boxes. We've got things like Sen's working on, like, Corroded Chronicles, where it's still one-time play, but it's like almost like retro computer, sequencing, point and click. But think how much more space there is in that one-time play now that we are open to what that could be.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't have to be legacy anymore.
Games kind of started
broke in. Yeah. It's like they broke the dam. But now the question is, well, couldn't that really be anything?
Mm-hmm.
And so, especially with where it's starting to go now, I would love to have a conversation about what's possible.
Yeah. Very cool. And the other thing is Friday night forums are still going on. I'll keep on going until I run out of things to talk about, which is probably never. You know me, I could talk forever. This is so this month being Pride Month, we're going to have people of all sorts of LGBTQIA plus stuff going on. And I'm actually bringing in mentors and mentees from the Tabletop Mentorship Program. This is the first round.
The new round has started up, didn't it?
This is the first time I've actually ever participated as a mentor or mentee. Usually I give like a class, but it's like, oh, I have some time. And it was like the right exact time. It's like, oh, I'll do this. And then I thought, well, you know what? Wouldn't it be nice for a lot of these people, and a lot of them suffer from, imposter syndrome, and just like, my games aren't good enough and things like that. Yeah. And so I want to elevate their voices and say, hey, let's talk about your game on a professional level, on a professional forum. We have an audience, people will watch it, it's fun and it's interesting. And so we have a lot of people who are like, yeah, I think I can do that. And so this Friday, we have a designer from Nigeria, Femi, and Katie Allred coming on to the show for Friday Night Forum at 8:00 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. So we'll see you then. Other than that, Tanya, are you ready? Final advice, 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay, very quickly, I think that a publisher who wants to expand their market should hire Mick and Starla because they're amazing. And I think that that's trite, but I think it's a very, very important thing that you need to work with people who understand how to scaffold and teach games, and who can get energy up and expand the marketplace, and use that sort of early tech approach of expanding out from the beachhead. The beachhead is established. The last thing that I will say too about that is my partner is kind of in the epicenter of game purchasers, and we are super saturated with games. In fact, we may have no room to walk soon. So, you got to radiate out, and you have to start hiring, just as Erica said, those grassroots, promoters of games, working with communities to evangelize why, games are important and a huge part of human existence. But also from a publisher perspective, from a profit perspective, they better start thinking about this like yesterday. And the other thing that I think, in terms of advice for the industry, the toxicity, these behaviors, curating your community is an imperative. You cannot let this stand. You may think you're going to lose your base because you try to shut down that kind of toxicity. It's actually going to benefit you in a myriad of ways and bottom line ways. You have to stop the toxicity. And that elitism, that snobbery, that focus on that super saturated base will mean that your company will not survive. And that's as stark as I can make it. Mm-hmm. And again, there's tons of sector case studies that we can look at that demonstrate that that is the case. And if you look again at large flourishing corporations, they're not sticking to their knitting. They're not snobbishly, elitistly, kind of mining that tiny little fragment of demography as a base, because there's nowhere to go from there, right? And so I think that would be my advice to the industry, to a publisher who's looking to survive. Period. You've got to get some of those early tech approaches, and hire evangelists, work on grassroots marketing, do minimal audience mapping, look at where your next radiation from that beachhead, where you should go next, and pivot there, and shut down toxicity in your communities, because it is impacting your bottom line.
Yep. All excellent thoughts. We have tons of people in the chat just saying thank you. They're looking at the data and just letting it sit. And I think we have some people in the audience who will do something about it as well. So thank you very much, Tanya, for coming on the
Thank you
show.
so much for having me.
Awesome.
No, it's been wonderful. And thank you everybody out there in Meeple Syrup Land for checking us out. We'll see you here next week at the same time, same place, and on Friday nights at 8 o'clock for the Friday Night Forum. Erica, any last words from you?
Hopefully 2 weeks from now I'll get to say who I'm going to go work for.
Yeah.
Because maybe I'll get to influence some of the things we're talking about.
Maybe.
Amazing.
All right. Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you later. Have a great night.